Well, good morning, everybody. Great to see you all this morning, and thanks, Natalie, for leading us so beautifully this morning. As Natalie said, last Sunday was up in Manchester, settling Ryan into university. Something that people didn't tell me was when you settle somebody in university accommodation, you need to take marigold rubber gloves, you need to take cleaning materials, you need to take a screwdriver, because nothing works in student accommodation when you turn up. So instead of me relaxing and enjoying a Sunday morning at my old church in Manchester, I was up to my eyeballs with marigolds and Dettol and goodness knows what else last week. But anyway, he's okay, he's in, and it's a joy to be with you this morning. Although I have to confess, it's my second speaking engagement of the morning. You're like, David, where could you fit something else in? But yeah, at 9 o'clock this morning with the joy of Zoom, as it's called, I think it is, isn't it? I was giving a lecture on sport and ethics to a group of students in Northampton Theological College. So that was a bit weird this morning. Bit of an oxymoron, sport and ethics, but hey, sometimes we try and put them together. So I said, look, I need to go. I've got my proper job to get back to, so here I am. But thank you for coming this morning, and it's a joy to be with you. And a big hello to anybody who's watching online as well, as we carry on our series about learning from Jesus. Jesus was the most influential human being that's ever lived, and so we want to learn from him and understand from him. And today we're just looking at this question about ambition. Are you an ambitious person? You know, do you want to change the world? Did you grow up with great ambitions and aspirations and that? Mine were all linked to sport, wanting to play for England, do this, do that. Or are you perhaps someone who's just, do you know what, David, I'm not ambitious. So keep it low key. I just want to be with someone and live my days out. And the reality of this really struck me back in May. My best friend from school passed away, and I just went over some of our messaging one to another over WhatsApp, really. And he was quite angry because he'd just been put into hospital, really, realizing that his final days were coming. And he said, David, it's just not fair. He said, I'm 58 years old. I've got ambitions to retire at 60, get a dog, and go for a walk with my wife and my kids and my friends. He said, that's all I want to do. And it's been taken away from me. So he wouldn't say that was any great ambition, but it was something that was precious, because I kind of figured, well, I'd be one of those guys who would be walking with him as he walked his dog. And it kind of strikes you, isn't it? So what are our ambitions? Maybe they're grandiose, maybe they're huge, maybe they're small. But there is one ambition that we can actually achieve, unlike my friend John. And this is this ambition to serve. Because this is an ambition of Jesus. This lines up with Jesus' heart and Jesus' passion. And it sounds dreadful, doesn't it? It sounds awful. Oh, I aspire to serve. That sounds rubbish, doesn't it? You know, you'd want, no, I aspire to change the world. I aspire to accumulate this, to get this, to make that position, to do this, to do that. And yet the reality is, as Jesus fulfilled his ambition to serve, he did change the world. And we're still reaping the benefits of it today by being sat in this building and listening to his word. So please, as we think about serving, see the big picture. See the potential impact. Because this is what Jesus did. He set the example when it came to serving. He didn't just preach and teach it. He set the tone for it, if you like. He addressed expectations. So often we want the glory, the high position. And Jesus said, no, do you know what? That will come eventually. But please just be faithful in serving just as he was. And thirdly, we need to embody something different. Because part of our struggle with serving is it's so countercultural. If you go to a school or go to a college and they talk about careers and things like this, I doubt serving will be too high on the agenda. It's usually something more grandiose than that. And yet, Jesus embodied this servant spirit as such. So as we have been dipping in and out over the last few years into the Gospel of Mark, we're going to continue with this. And this is for the power-hungry audience in Rome, this first century account of the life, the times of Jesus. And they're basically for People who thrived on being educated and being entertained. And as you can imagine, if you lived in Rome, you're used to winning and used to dominating and used to having power, because that was the center of the human power empire of that time and day. And this kind of resonates with us, because coming from the West, we're used to seeing our power, used to seeing being us in control. And yet Jesus provides a shocking countercultural example of having power, yet not using it to bless himself, but using it to serve others and impact and change the world. So it's this radical new model we're going to look at in Mark chapter 10. And Jesus had been demonstrating this right throughout his life, but now he really cranks it up a level in the last few weeks of his earthly ministry. And he's been teaching his followers about how to thrive in marriage, how to help kids. And Jesus lays out the costs of expectations of what it really means to follow him. And there was a rich young ruler who said, yeah, Jesus, I want to follow you. But when he heard the cost, the reality of what it meant to serve Jesus, he was like, do you know what? Forget it. But there was a group of young men who were choosing to follow Jesus. And they were saying, well, what about us? We've made that decision, Jesus. We've already proved it for 3 years. We're going to follow you. And Jesus said, right, let me tell you, there will be a reward both in this world and the one to come. But I want you to talk about serving. So within that context of Jesus talking about the reward, let's revisit the words that Natalie read for us from Mark chapter 10. As we think about the setting of an example, the addressing expectations, and trying to embody that which is different. Let's jump in at Mark 10:32. They were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. So we see this picture of a journey. They were based down by the Jordan River on the eastern side of Israel. They're now heading west. And of course, Jerusalem is based on a small mountain or a very large hill as such. So it was upward, difficult, physical journey. And Jesus is leading the way. And it's astonishing, and it's also amazing that he is leading the way, because what was going to face him in Jerusalem wasn't nice. And this is what these others knew about. The disciples were astonished he was going there. Other people were afraid because they knew if Jesus went to Jerusalem, it would probably be the end. There was a corrupt leadership based in Jerusalem, and they were looking for a way to kill and finish off Jesus. So both being a follower of Jesus, being Jesus himself, Jerusalem was a dangerous place. That's why these groups of people were A, astonished, because it didn't make any sense to go to the place of danger, and B, it was terrifying. They knew they could be also struggling and suffering in that situation. But Jesus, for the third time, points out to the disciples, he is not shocked by this. He knew what was coming. This was part of the God plan. But now he goes into great detail, and actually pretty graphic detail, on what was going to happen to him. It continues in verse 33, we're going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. These chief priests were about 7 small families who dominated the Jerusalem political scene. And it would be nice to think they were chief priests, but actually they behaved more like mafia. They controlled, they dominated, and if anybody came against them, they would be in real trouble. And so there's this picture of Jesus being handed over to them. And he uses this title, the Son of Man. Now, sometimes in the first part of our Bible, in the Old Testament, that just refers to people. But other times, particularly in the book of Daniel, it refers to someone who has been heaven sent. The heaven sent one. And this is the way Jesus is using it here. As the one sent from heaven, he's going to be handed over to these people. And Jesus' agenda was never, when he was sent from heaven, right, I'm going to beat people, I'm going to judge people, I'm going to stop people, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. He just came with this beautiful serving agenda. He came with this agenda to forgive and show compassion. And yet, he was going to be punished for it, which was quite shocking for the disciples of the day. This is now the drop-down detail. they will condemn him to death. They will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise. So we see this alliance that's being formed here between this mafia-like Jerusalem leadership and the Roman authorities, and they're going to sentence Jesus to death. As if that isn't bad enough. Of course, we know the story from Easter. It's the beating, it's the mocking, it's the contempt, it's the violence that is demonstrated on someone who came with this forgiveness agenda, who came with this compassionate agenda. It seems just not right. And if any of you have seen the film The Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson's movie from a number of decades ago, it's probably the most graphic depiction of the suffering and death of Jesus. And it really drives it home. And it really drives it home even more when you think, Jesus did it for me. Jesus did it for me. He died, he suffered in my place because of my failure, my shortcomings. He did this so we can be restored to God. And this picture of restoration is there at the end. 3 days later, he will rise. There is victory over sin. There is victory over Satan. There's victory over evil as Jesus conquers death. It's not the end. And this is how the serving model changes the world, because eventually it will lead to restoration. So again, as you think about your ambition, you might say, David, I don't want to change the world, I just want to change my world. Well, the serving agenda is going to be the way to do it. This is the model of Jesus. You can set the example to bring about that kind of change. Let's move on and address some expectations. Then James and John, in verse 35, the sons of Zebedee came to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you? He asked. Isn't it bizarre? After Jesus just shared about the beating and everything that's going to go on and how he's going to be killed, 2 of his closest followers, actually 2 of his cousins, come to him and say, we've got a request of you, Jesus. I know you've got a few things on your plate, but actually, can I share my agenda with you? It just seems very inappropriate, doesn't it? Such a solemn thing has been shared, and yet ambition just rises up. Thanks for sharing that, Jesus. Let me tell you about my plans. Just feels really awkward, doesn't it? Well, they carried on, and it got worse. They replied, let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. You don't know what you're asking, Jesus said. So these 2 young men, probably in their late teens, said, Jesus, we're getting it. There's going to be reward. There's going to be glory here eventually. It's going to be tough. But hey, we want in. When you're there in your kingdom, seated and enthroned, we want to be right next to you. We'll keep it in the family. It's a family thing here. This sense of aspiration, wanting to be part of the glory. And actually, it's quite bizarre that when Jesus is sometimes referred to as being glorified when he was on the cross, there was a thief either side of him. And I think James and John are trying to do a bit of thieving here right now as they want some of that glory. And Jesus calls them out on it, saying, you really don't know what you're talking about here, guys. It's serving. It's suffering. The glory will come eventually, but actually while we're here on earth, if there's no pain, there's no gain as such. And we can see this unpacked with this picture and illustration Jesus uses from the Old Testament. Can you drink from the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with? We can, they answered. This picture of cup and baptism, you can read about it a little bit in the Psalms and in the book of Isaiah from our Old Testament. And it's this picture of suffering, this idea of drinking in suffering and struggle, the idea of baptism, which we sometimes do here in Westroad site, the idea of being immersed in sorrow and suffering. Jesus is saying, gentlemen, I know you want the glory, but while you're here on earth, can you take on board the suffering and the struggle? Because you're going to be immersed in it if you're serious about following me in that point in time. And of course, they were quite confident when they said, yeah, we can. And Jesus affirms it. He says to them, you will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right hand, right or left, is not for me to grant. These places belong to those to whom they have been prepared. So Jesus affirms to James and John, yeah, you're right. You are going to suffer. You are going to struggle. They were going to see that within 2 weeks because they would witness the events that happened to Jesus. But then for the years that would follow, as we read our Bibles, we see they were imprisoned, they were killed, they were martyred for their faith. And so they did take this on board. So that youthful bravado, that youthful ambition, in a way, God says, yeah, we can use this. We can use this, but let's get the expectations right. Those places of glory belong to those who have been prepared. Jesus is saying, do you know what, boys? We're here on earth. Let's deal with what we're facing here on earth, and let heaven worry about heaven. Let glory worry about glory. Right now, I just want you to be faithful. I want you to see the model I'm doing and carry that out. And sometimes this is a struggle for us because we think Christianity is easy. We think Christianity is like this, I don't know, some kind of machine where we just, put our money in and something good comes out and it's happy clappy and it's blessing. But actually the reality is, it is about serving. If we're serious about following Jesus, that means we must be serious about serving others because that is the Jesus agenda. That was the Jesus ambition. That was the Jesus model to change the world. And as I said, we reap the benefits of it. So as we're beginning to talk about vision aims as a church, as we're beginning to unpack some of our hopes and aspirations for these coming years, whatever we share, it's always got to be underpinned with this idea of we need to serve. Whether people inside our church or people outside our church. Serve, serve, serve is the way we change the world. And because our vision statement says we want to see transformation in Bury St Edmunds, well, do you know the way we've got to do it? It's by serving. Then God can go to work in us and through us because this is the Jesus model. The reality to see change, the reality to see impact means there is a cost. And the chances are it's a cost for you and it's a cost for me and anybody who's serious about it. And this is what Jesus is trying to lay out as part of the expectations. No easy wins here to see transformation and change in people. Let's move on to our final points. This idea of embodying something different, embodying the alternative to what the world often presents. We read in verses 41 and 42, when the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. In a way, we're seeing a picture that James and John weren't that bad. They were just as bad as the other guys because the other guys were upset. Why were they upset? They were probably upset that they hadn't thought about this scam that James and John were trying to do. They wanted their place. They wanted their role. They wanted the glory as well. And so they're all getting angry. And Jesus says, hey, boys, come in. Teachable moment. Come on. Let's nip this in a bud right now. And he starts to present this contrast. He presents a contrast that the Roman Empire, the Roman world presented versus what he was trying to model. And he said, you know those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over other people. They use their power to put other people down. They use their political influence to big themselves up and to feather their own nest. But Jesus says we should not be like this. Jesus came with no real position, no real power, no real palace to live in. And he said, no, there's a different way. There's an alternative way. I want you as my followers to live. He continues, their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be a servant. If we have a sense in which we want to change the world, Jesus is saying it's not by using power in a negative way. It's actually by relinquishing power that we make a difference. Jesus says, I need you to live a different life. Because the world and the way it lives it, the way people use power and abuse power is not going to change anything. It's when we serve, when we become giveaway. If you want to be great, it starts with great acts of humility. It starts with you beginning to serve. And this word servant, There's many sort of different translations for it. Sometimes we get the word deacon or minister for church, but primarily it's the idea of waiting upon somebody. Now, a number of our young people in particular, I think they serve away at like Subway and Costa and Marks and Spencer's and all that. They get what it means to wait on somebody. Somebody gives them their orders. Somebody tells them what they want, and they go and do it. This is the picture and image here. Jesus is saying we hear other people's agendas and we act upon it. We hear what they want and we start to act upon it. We set ourselves aside in order to do that. This is the servant role Jesus is talking about. And then he cranks it up another level. He says, whoever wants to be first must be a slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus never, ever played the don't you know who I am card. Have you ever been in that setting where it's embarrassing, where someone's trying to get ahead by saying, don't you know who I am? Jesus not only has a servant attitude, but he sets aside his position and says, you must become a slave. A slave is even lower than a servant. A servant gets paid. A servant can pick and choose to a certain extent when they work and how they work. A slave does not even own their own identity. They belong to somebody else. In Roman culture, to be a slave was basically be a piece of furniture that breathes. And Jesus is saying, I want you to embrace this mentality. I want you to basically say, I've got no agenda, God. I surrender to you. My identity is your slave, to carry out your purposes, to serve other people. For this is the model that Jesus demonstrated. Demonstrated it supremely when he went to that cross. The language used here, gave his life as a ransom for many. When we think about ransom, we think about someone who's in bondage, someone who's held by somebody else, but then on the payment of a ransom, that person is released and set free. And this is what Jesus is saying. I want to set you free from your power-crazy antics. I want to set you free from your selfish behavior. I want to set you free from all this me stuff. I want you to follow my model. And I want you to embrace the life I am offering you as the one who served so powerfully and changed the world. So, of course, we ask the question, have you said yes to Jesus? He died that you might be liberated. Have you said yes? Have you said, Jesus, I want you in my life? And secondly, if we have said yes, are we embracing the Jesus ambition to serve others? Or are we just saying, thank you very much, Jesus, I'll now carry on with my own agenda? Because it doesn't really work like that. The God agenda is to serve and to respond in that way, because this is the way we change the world. And so finally, what has Jesus been saying to you this morning about ambition? You might say, yeah, David, I do want to change the world. Well, as we've been chatting about a little bit this morning, it is going to cost time, treasure, talent, sacrificing self in order to see this happen. And I just hope and pray there'll be enough of us will decide to join together with this serving agenda, and we can start to see the transformation happen in our town. For our vision is to be a Jesus-centered people. In other words, we focus on Jesus, we learn from Jesus, then we apply it in our setting, which is to see transformation come to Bury St Edmunds and beyond. Now, my hope and my dream is it's not just an aspirational vision. It's not just something we say and put it on trust fund applications. I actually want to see it happen. And for it to happen, enough of us are going to have to embrace this servant model, because this is what changes the world. This is what brings transformation. When we set aside our power-crazy antics and start to say, God, what do you want for this situation? How can I serve? And I've got to say, it works. We've seen it work because we've got a church full of people here today that what Jesus has done still is making an impact. But I have to say it's working as well in terms of the council, in terms of people we're talking to. They can't get their heads around why Bridge Community Church does what Bridge Community Church does in our community. We were invited to meet with some town councillors last week. Emma and I went over there. And Emma said, you've got to come because they love what we do, but they can't understand the motive behind what we do. It doesn't make any sense why people should be so generous with their time, their talent, and their gifts, and their skills, and their treasure. They just couldn't get their heads around it. And I was expecting to be absolute caning of theological questions of, oh, are you doing this? Are you doing that? Or why are you doing this? And there was none of it. Just counselor after counselor came up to me saying, we love what you are doing. It is making such a difference in our town. This is the radical alternative we're talking about. No agenda except God's agenda to serve, even if it costs and hurts, so that people can discover freedom and life in Christ. So yeah, this is our church vision. This is what we're going to be talking about in the next few weeks. This is what we're going to ask you to partner with on the 15th of October. So I hope and I pray that God's going to do some talking with your heart and with your minds about what it looks like for you. Just 3 things have popped up here to finally conclude. Is it by forgiving someone? Could that be the first step of service you do for someone? You forgive them. Again, how radical that is. In our culture, which seems to, get your own back, get your head, bear a grudge, make sure you get them. We're going to say, no, we're going to let it go because that's what Jesus did. Secondly, that expectation for faithful service. While we're here on earth, we live for that well done, good and faithful servant comment from Jesus. We don't live for whatever glory there might be on offer through being involved in a church. No, it's all for that whisper in our ear from Jesus, hey, you did great the way you served there. Keep going. Keep going. And thirdly, will we embody something different? Will we wait on other people? Will we turn up without an agenda and just say, I'm here to serve? I remember a good friend of mine, well, he became a good friend. He came to work for the Christian organization I was involved with a number of years ago. And he drove me mad because he had such a serving agenda. I used to say to him, what do you want to do, Christopher? And he said, whatever you want me to do, David, that's what I want to do. Where do you want to live, Christopher? Wherever you want me to live, David, that's what I want to do. What do you actually want to do, Christopher? Whatever you tell me to do, David, that's what I want to do. And I'm like, you're not really helping me here when I'm trying to place you in a situation where you can make a difference. And he goes, I'm just copying what Jesus did. I'm here to serve. And you're meant to be my boss, so give me something to do. Incredibly powerful testimony. This guy served in some of the toughest areas in Greater Manchester. And he loved it because he just was on track with Jesus. He then went to South Africa and served on townships down there. He's the only white guy for miles around on this. A scaffolder from Birmingham was transforming some of these townships because he was embracing some of this attitude. Oh, for some more people like that. Thank you for those who are embracing this. And come on, hopefully more people will join. And let's live for that commendation from Jesus. Well done, good and faithful servant. Let me pray. I'll invite the worship band to worship King Jesus again as we finish off. Jesus, I thank you for the model you demonstrated. I thank you it wasn't just an example, but it was life-changing. When you went to that cross, you died in our place. You liberated us from sin, from death, from our own selfishness. You set us free, Jesus. But in our freedom, Lord, would you move and work in our hearts to actually become slaves and servants again, not for something negative like selfish ambition, but for your plans, your purposes, your will. Lord, help us to live for that verbal commendation from you of well done, good and faithful servant. Any other agenda apart from this, help us to set aside, Jesus, so that we can see the change and transformation you died for. We can see it here in our town and beyond. We ask this in your precious name. Amen.